ready? Say I'm ready. Samurai and firm resolve, on balance, economic sanctions are reducing the threat Russia poses to Western interests. We observe that according to Penn professor Daniel McCormick, because exogenous events can occur while sanctions are in place, to assess the efficacy of sanctions, one must compare a world with or without sanctions rather than compare before and after sanctions were implemented. Our sole contention is that sanctions are essential to stopping Russia's advance. After Russia's invasion of Crimea in February of 2014, the US and the EU placed sanctions on Russia, destroying their access to capital, technology, and other goods. These sanctions have halted Russia's expansion in three ways. First is by sending a signal. Artis Pabrikis writes in the New York Times, Putin calculated that he could get away with the annexation because he faced no serious consequences after his war against Georgia in 2008. They saw Western inaction as proof they could get away with it again. That a similar risk comes with trying to appease Russia, this time in the Ukraine. That's what Chatham Servizio Lutzovich writes, that anything less than sanction constitutes tacit approval and emboldens Russia, as they would see no cost to stealing territory and destabilizing Europe. Thus, in the long run, Iana Dreyer, the EU Institute for Security Studies, writes, sanctions minimize the risk that Russia will seek to openly destabilize other parts of Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia. Second is by ensuring threat credibility. NATO's Edward Christie reports that sanctions scope, both in terms of number of nations covered and number of texts targeted, signals credibility, resolve, and unity, which acts as both a reassurance to our allies, but also as a warning to Russia. Third is by limiting their economic capacity. The IMF reports that sanctions by themselves have already shrunk Russia's economy by 1.5%, a figure that Mark Thompson of CNN expects to rise to 9% in the near future. As a result, according to McCormick, Russia has cut their subsidies to eastern Ukraine. As the Brookings Institute reports, Russia is struggling to afford the territory it already has, and now certainly what Russia cannot afford to do is win Ukraine. Historically, Rice professor Clifton Morgan finds empirically that economic sanctions, when their effects are severe, are successful 94% of the time. We have already seen these effects on the ground. Dreyer observes, thanks to sanctions, the coastal city of Mariupol was not seized by Russia when it easily could have been. There's been no attempt by Russian forces to forge a corridor bridging mainland Russia to Crimea, let alone Odessa and Transnistria. Moses Naim of The Atlantic reports, in the fall, pro-Russian soldiers and weapon systems were withdrawn from eastern Ukraine. Russian-supported separatist leaders have been saying that, for them, the war there is over, they have lost. Even in the long term, it is looking like the Ukraine is safer. Stanislav Zakrieru, the Polish Institute for International Affairs, writes, sanctions against Russia bought invaluable time for Ukraine to elect new political leadership and buttress its defenses. Moreover, Naim continues, rhetorically, the Kremlin seems to be curbing its belligerence as well. The Russian government recently even offered to help Ukraine restructure some of its debt to Russia and stabilize its economy. A world without sanctions would have seen Russia bulldozing over the Ukrainian border, perhaps pushing onwards to other countries. With sanctions, we have an effective Western response that has blunted the conflict. This is paramount for three reasons. First, as Lauren Van Meter of the Institute for Peace writes, Russia's annexation of Crimea and the military operations in eastern Ukraine have overturned the post-Cold War norms that have ensured European stability for 2 decades. Sanctions ensure these norms. Second, Van Meter explains, neighboring countries are recalculating their security and foreign policies based on Russia's aggression and the West's response. We need a meaningful response to ensure their trust. Third, K.R. Giles of the Chatham House writes, Ukraine's failure deepens instability in Eastern Europe and increases the risk of further Kremlin adventures. That is to say, if Russia sees no consequences for its aggression, it keeps becoming aggressive. The Ukraine is just a test. Sanctions prove to Russia that the West won't just let them steal part of another nation. Because anything less than sanctions is appeasement, Sam and I are incredibly proud to affirm.
Is everybody ready?
Not me. You want to grab a drink first?
Alright, everyone's good? We negate that on balance economic sanctions are reducing the threat that Russia poses to Western interests, and contention 1 is the empire strikes back. There are 4 reasons why sanctions increase Russian aggression, and the first is nationalism. Sanctions offer a unique ability for Putin to boost nationalist sentiment. According to Laskin of the journal Political Risk in 2015, international isolation caused by sanctions allows the target government to control ideas and information within their society and nurture nationalism. Bertoli of UC Berkeley in 2013 confirms that nationalism can undermine international cooperation, motivate societies to fight costly wars, and cause governments to overestimate their relative military power. Second is oligarchs. Targeted sanctions on business oligarchs are shifting Russia's political hierarchy. The Week in 2014 explains that Putin has cost the most powerful Russian businessmen's companies hundreds of millions of dollars in market value, and as a result, the European Council on Foreign Relations in 2014 writes that sanctions have marginalized pro-Western members of the Russian elite, while military hardliners have been strengthened more than before. As a result, the Christian Science Monitor in 2015 writes that members of Russia's military security establishment are now shaping the Kremlin's foreign policy. These hardliners are the reason why Ukrainian rebels are still pushing their offensive and talking of building a 100,000-strong reserve army to bring the fight to Kiev. Third is anti-Westernism. Sanctions provide the perfect cover for Moscow to redirect attention from its failed economic policies to blame the West. Peleshchuk in 2014 writes in Salon magazine that Putin has sidestepped the severity of Russia's tanking economy. Instead, he blames the West for attempting to sabotage his country's economy, comparing Western sanctions against Russia to Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union. Signs of the National Interest in 2015 finds that with 66% of Russians believing that Western sanctions are meant to weaken and humiliate Russia, many have rallied around the flag and embraced Putin as protector against foreign onslaught. Many regard sanctions as an assault on themselves in addition to their country. Fourth is economic harms. Sanctions are contributing significantly to Russia's economic woes. Spokane at PBS writes in 2015 that because of sanctions, no financial institutions have dared to provide Russia with any financing. As a result, Russia cannot mitigate its recession by borrowing money. In addition to losing a safety net, Dresner in 2015 also finds that in 2014, more than $150 billion in private sector capital left Russia to avoid the prospect of sanctions. The Economist in 2015 furthers that Russians value two qualities: wealth and military strength. The less Putin can provide of the former at home, the more he must demonstrate the latter abroad. The Financial Times further in 2014 that recession means Russia's government can no longer use money to buy public acceptance. Repression and propaganda have to take up the slack. Nothing could be more helpful than a small, victorious military adventure. It has spawned an aggressive foreign policy to which Western leaders are now struggling to respond. There are two places where Russia has increased aggression against the West, and the first is in Ukraine. According to Gibbons Neff of the Washington Post, as of New Year's Eve, a true ceasefire is way off. The fact that the number of ceasefire violations in the last weeks of December had increased in eastern Ukraine reflects a worrying development that as the year ends. In December, there was a marked increase in fighting. Second is Syria. Word of the Star in 2015 reports that Russia's military action in Syria is a ploy to ease Western sanctions that punish Moscow for its incursions into Ukraine. Throughout the entire world, conflict between the West and Russia has increased, as Reuters in 2016 confirmed that as a result of this aggression, a new Russian appraisal names the United States as one of the threats to Russia's national security for the first time. Letskian of Texas A&M in 2007 quantifies, finding that sanctions increase the probability of militarized conflict by 17%. Oliphant of the Telegraph in 2015 reports that Russia and NATO are actively preparing for war in Europe amidst the greatest buildup of military tension in Europe since the end of the Cold War. For these reasons, we are very proud to negate.
So your fourth sub-point of your first contention, you're conceding that sanctions are causing major economic harms.
Yes.
You have one question.
Sure. So when you talk about how Russia has decreased its military spending,
yes.
If they're the second,
well, actually, that's the argument.
Or
is
how
economic
economic harms harm the Russian military, right?
Yes.
Oh wait, actually, could we talk about the subsidies thing for a second? Why is it necessary to pay industry subsidies to hold land in Ukraine?
As we learned in the Iraq invasion, occupying a foreign country that is hostile is incredibly difficult.
I agree.
Okay,
wait.
The reason why you need to subsidize the Ukrainian industry is that the only way to get the local support sufficient to maintain an occupation.
Why does Russia need local support in Crimea, where they are all Russian nationalists?
I said Eastern Ukraine. I didn't say Crimea.
Okay.
That's because it's inclusive of the Donbass, Luhansk, Donetsk. It's not
where
just
they are
Crimea.
also mainly Russian nationalists.
I'm telling you that even if some of them support you, if
The
you
majority of them support.
occupying any country as supportive as you want is absurdly difficult. You don't have the support on the ground.
According to The Guardian, Eastern Ukraine hit the sweet spot for Russia because what happened is that there are two types of nationalism in Russia. There are the ethnic nationalists and the expansionist nationalists.
Okay.
Eastern Ukraine satisfied both of them because the expansionists got more land and the ethnicists were able to maintain ethnic
That's not actually responsive.
continuity. Yes, it is.
No, it's not responsive to the analysis that
You
The
said
Ukrainian, no, not the Russian people need support. The Ukrainian people they're occupying, they're not expansionists for Russia. They're not in Russia.
You said we need to pay business subsidies to keep people happy.
I don't remember saying the word business.
Industry subsidies.
I don't remember saying the word industry in case.
No, your car. Okay, fine. Then your car in McCormick specifically says that the reason why is because we need to pay subsidies to industries.
Okay, I'm also going to contend in the big
You
picture
said
of
it was to
military
keep,
spending
wait,
is going down in other regards.
Will, can we keep on track for a second?
Yeah.
You said it was to keep people happy, correct?
Yes.
Okay, why do the people in eastern Ukraine who are largely Russian nationalists need to be kept happy?
Because it doesn't matter if like 70% of the support it. 30% of people actively opposing an occupying force can cause absurd amount of difficulty.
So
We saw this in
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan.
30% of people are going to overthrow Russia in Crimea and the rest of
I'm not saying they're going to overthrow, I'm saying it's going to make it absurdly costly to do so. We learned the lessons of Afghanistan that a small number of people actively opposing an occupying force can cause incredible damage.
What about what I read you in case, which says that one of the best ways to keep people happy, especially in Russia, is a small military incursion that's successful?
Yeah, that's why we say we need to prevent them from being successful.
No,
that's the entire thesis of the affirmative case. That when you increase the cost for aggression, Russia is less likely to be aggressive. Our number one goal is to prevent that small military incursion from being successful.
Your argument is that we need to keep people happy in order for Russia to
No, that is
stable.
one card. The overall thesis, right, the thematic element of our case is that Russia is likely to be aggressive when their consequences.
Your thesis' warrant relies on that, as we have seen throughout the
4
last
minutes
3
of case does not rely on one minor card that we read. Right. Yes. Okay, that was 7 seconds.
Okay.
That's what you said. Is that what you got?
Yeah.
Okay. We're ready? Yeah. Okay. I'd first like to start with this idea of the framework. We explained to you from McCormick that instead of evaluating this round of whether it happened before and after sanctions, where it's really hard to determine causality, we should instead look to a world with or without sanctions. The reason why this is really important is because if absent sanctions we're seeing violence goes up. It doesn't matter whether after sanctions are implemented, violence goes up a little bit. If it's less than what would happen if we didn't have sanctions in the first place, that's still going to be a net positive for U.S. interests. To the point where we show you where last time we didn't institute sanctions, for instance in Georgia, where Russia seized South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and Moldova, where they seized Transnistria, what I did, this according to Perdriek, is that it actually encouraged Putin to expand into Crimea because he thought there would be no consequences. We can see that even if they proved you the violence has gone up since sanctions, to the point where it's significantly less than what would happen if no sanctions were implemented at all, that's still a reason to vote for us. Now let's go into the first if only contention where they make the Star Wars illusion. Now first off, before I get into their warrants, the one overall thing I'd like to do here, just outweigh this argument. Everything they tell you in this case basically tells you why Russia has a greater incentive and to expand. It doesn't tell you they actually have the capacity to do so. And this is the thesis of Will and Mai's case. We explain to you that by sending the signal and by destroying the economy of the country, what happens according to Brookings is that they can no longer afford to actually be able to expand. It's not just the subsidies that ICON likes to focus on, it's the overall military spending. This outweighs because even if they prove to you that the intent goes up, if their capacity goes down, then the threat goes down and sanctions have succeeded. Now to the first warrant, which talks about nationalism. First, they want here to pull a page out of John Lennon's book and just imagine that these cards are about Russia. They are not. They're general analysis, which is a big problem because Dreyer actually looks specifically at Russia. And what she explains is that Russia's social contract is based on this idea of giving up a fair amount of rights in exchange for having economic security. To the point where they concede that sanctions are shattering the economic security, therefore you also shatter the social contract and decrease nationalism over the long run. Then they give you this warrant which talks about oligarchs. The problem with this is when they tell you themselves that you're marginalizing specific sectors of the elite. The problem with that is that when, according to Kimberly Martin of Columbia, what's happening when you marginalize these sectors of the elite is you see infighting, which is more likely to be destabilizing Russia in the long run. Because then they tell you that members of the hardliners who actually succeed are more likely to have this ear. That doesn't make sense. Putin doesn't determine who's in the inner circle by looking at the Forbes rankings of billionaires and just saying, okay, now you're on my National Security Council. Just because they're losing money does not mean they necessarily have their ear. And most importantly, it doesn't just because they have their ear does not mean they actually have the capacity to expand into the Ukraine or anywhere else. Now to the third thing they talk about, which is how they're going to be anti-Western. That is that you could boost Putin's support. The
first big problem with this is then why does this matter? Putin is, first off, had such high levels of support beforehand, so increasing it even higher isn't an impact. But second, Russia is an authoritarian regime. They don't depend on popular support. To the point where that's true, it doesn't matter if the support is going up, because it doesn't actually affect the ultimate result on the ground. Then they talk about how there's going to be economic harms. The first big problem with this is, again, this concedes the economic harms. This is really important when Morgan tells you when you have these severe economic harms, essentially succeed 94% of the time. That on face outweighs my opponent's arguments on probability. Then they say this, the economist argument that says when you harm the economy, that means they shore up support by strengthening the military. The problem is that those two things aren't separate. When you have a weak economy, you can't afford to disband the military. That's why Brookings explains that Russia can no longer afford to win in Ukraine. Then they give you this quote, and I want to quote this here. The quote, "Nothing could be more helpful to Putin than a military victory." That's actually really important for our case, because we explain to you that absent sanctions, Russia wants to expand further into Ukraine. A military victory is more likely if you see no cost to Putin's actions. Then they talk about how they're going to be expanding Ukraine. We saw an increase in violence in December. Yes, there was a 1-month blip in violence, but we're seeing overall it's decreasing, especially when Naim tells you that since the fall they've been actually pulling out of eastern Ukraine. Then they tell you it's going to be going to Syria because of an intent to ease sanctions. That's not true at all. The real reason they're going to Syria, according to McFall of Stanford University, is because Syria is a major ally of the Putin, because they have the main naval base on the Mediterranean. It's not at all because of what they're telling you. Then they give you this Letsky analysis about increasing conflict. They said that's only true 1 year after sanctions. We've had sanctions more 1 year, and it's not something you should vote on. Thank you.
Okay, we'll run some prep time, please. Yeah, I got it. My opponent's ready. Partner. Yep. Judges. Okay. Start off with an overview. When Putin invaded Crimea in 2014, that was the only piece of Ukraine he wanted. This is for two reasons. First, that's where his strategic interests lay. Crimea has access to the Black Sea, and essentially taking the rest of Ukraine would threaten the buffer state effect that Putin wants with Ukraine. If he takes all of Ukraine, that edges him up towards Western countries. On that, when he is near Western countries in such a way, that increases the chance that conflict erupts between Russia and the West, which Putin clearly does not want because he would clearly lose that war. So what that means essentially is Putin would not have triggered more into Ukraine unless he was coerced more. That's what we tell you essentially happens through sanctions. It was never in his original strategic interest to invade into other parts of Ukraine. So if there is any militarism increasing in the status quo, that is because there has been a change made to Putin's strategic calculus. We tell you that that's because of sanctions, and we give you warrant for that in our case. But moreover, let's go into their observation about like choosing between about world with sanctions, world without sanctions. The problem is they assume that the world without sanctions would mean nothing. But foreign policy is never limited to simply just a choice of doing something or doing nothing. There's lots of other alternatives, for example, like positive incentives. For example, right, the way that we enforced the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was that the UN told countries that if they gave up their own nuclear programs, they would gain access to civilian-grade nuclear technology. That's how we were able to control their development. So at the end of the day, we can use like positive carrot measures instead of stick measures like sanctions. Let me make this clear. I'm not trying to make an advocacy, but don't let them come up here and tell you without sanctions, Ukraine would just get totally bulldozed because they don't have a crystal ball and they can't look
what would happen in the alternative. But let's go into their first and only contention, which is generally about aggression. First, they tell you that essentially sanctions create a signal. But the problem is that leaders like Putin view things from a balance of power perspective. They know that if they concede to sanctions, they appear weak among their people. Maintaining an aura of fear and infallibility is the way that they stabilize their regime. That's why sanctions make Putin less likely to concede conflict in Ukraine, because it'll appear that he's backing down to the West. Overall, Leskian finds that there's a 17% increase in conflict because of this effect. But then they tell you that it reassures our allies. First of all, this reassurance clearly is not working in the face of what Russia's actions have been actually happening. First, Russia's military spending has increased 33% over the past year because Putin has simply restructured the budget and cut from other places of spending. But moreover, the card from the bottom of our case tells you that NATO is mobilizing in response because they're taking the increase in the threat credibly as well. That's not increasing reassurance among our allies, that's increasing fear among our allies. Then they tell you that the economic strength of Russia goes down. But first of all, realize that this is the whole warrant behind our fourth warrant of our first contention. The reason for Putin's military aggression is economic decline, because this is the only way that he knows how to power project and maintain stability of his people. Overall, Andrew Wood of the Royal Institute of International Affairs finds that the root cause of the challenge posed to the West by Russia lies in the country's internal development and its failure to provide a satisfactory development program over the long term. They're only increasing this problem by creating sanctions. But let's go into some of their impacts. First, they tell you that 94% of sanctions have worked when the costs are high. First of all, even if the costs are high, they don't prove that the costs are high enough to reach their impact. Pape of Stanford explains that sanctions fail 95% of the time. That means only 5% of all sanctions have ever had high enough cost to create a concession. Unless they prove that sanctions in Russia are among the 5% most costly sanctions of all time, they don't reach the brink of impact to reach this card. But it's not Russia specific, which they themselves tell you is like looking to John Lennon's Imagine, so you shouldn't weigh it anyways. Finally, they essentially tell you that we'd see bulldozing Ukraine in the absence of sanctions. But realize this is all dependent on the fact that without sanctions, we would simply have done nothing. But realistically, those are never the two only foreign policy options. Finally, they tell you essentially that there would be more aggression in Ukraine without sanctions, but we tell you he didn't want those parts of Ukraine. Sorry. You get the first question.
I did. So, my judges, are you ready?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about a response you made in your crossfire. Sorry, not crossfire. Wow.
Yeah. I feel you, brother.
In the rebuttal.
Yeah.
So you tell me that military spending has increased 33%. Is that a correct characterization of your response?
Yeah. That's
Okay. So was that military increase in military expenditures? Was that budgeted before or after sanctions were instituted?
After.
No, that's not true.
2015.
Right. The 2015 budget. The problem with this is that when the 2015 budget was not, the original plan does not come from December 31st, 2015.
Great.
When did it actually be instituted?
What?
When was the actual plan for the 2015 military budget? When was that first announced?
I don't know. You tell me. You seem to know.
I did.
Okay.
It was in 2010. And what they did is they had a budget for 2011 through 2020.
All right.
The reason why that's really important, okay?
If you can show me where my evidence says that, that's fine. But
I can show you
beyond that,
because we can provide you the evidence here. Here's why it's really important, Harrison, okay?
yeah.
I don't care what you're sighing, but okay.
Listen, I have something. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we're all tired. But anyways, the reason why it's really important is because the increase in expenditures is not because of sanctions, it was planned beforehand.
Okay, great.
Relative to that original plan, in fiscal year 2016, how is it an increase or decrease relative to that original plan?
Let me guess, it's a decrease, according
You
to
guessed right.
Even if that's true, even if you were causing a relative decrease, CNBC reports that as of December, an independent analysis found that Russia's military spending is at an all-time high.
I agree
Even
that
if you prove to
CNBC
me,
said that. I also agree that 4 paragraphs later, CNBC says these all-time highs are unsustainable because of their weakening economy.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to see that.
It's your own.
Wait, okay, so show me my card.
Okay, I can do that.
Second of all, how is it unsustainable if Putin can just restructure the spending?
Because in 2015, he tried to do that. As you say yourself in your rebuttal, he tried to cut, for instance, education and health spending. But you can't cut that every single year. That's why when we actually look at this,
taxes,
but they haven't done that because they're weakening the tax base. You try to raise the value of the taxes, but they can't actually get more money as a result.
Here's what actually occurred. They originally planned to have another increase of a similar margin. Instead, it's only 0.8% for next year. That's a significant decrease from their original plan.
Let's say we grant you the entire brink of impact, which I'm not, just to make that clear.
Okay.
Right? How does that translate into actual aggression if there's only like a 5% decrease in relative military spending?
It's not 5%.
How much is it?
We're going for the original plan, which is a continuation of what you were telling me
How
before
much?
of 30%.
Hold on. How much?
Here's
Here's
the overall
spending
analysis.
decrease because of sanctions?
We would tell you it's a decrease from the original plan, which is I believe 25%. But here's the most
how
important.
much
But these
did-
numbers are
that's
all
not-
abstract. Here's what the most important analysis is, and I want to make this clear.
Okay.
From the Brookings analysis, it says the decrease in spending is large enough that Russia can no longer afford to win in Ukraine.
Okay. Good thing they don't want.
Prep. Starting prep. Thank you. That's another 16, right?
Yep.
And so that, how much did we use before? 7. Okay, so 23 overall, so a minute 37. Is everyone ready? The framework that Sam and I provide is the only way to evaluate the efficacy of sanctions to compare a world with sanctions or without sanctions. They say there are alternatives to appeasement, including positive enforcement. The problem is this only encourages more aggression because Russia could just invade a country, pull out, and get the carrots that they talk about. The only solution that exists is sanctions. They provide no other alternative. Then they say that Russia only wanted Crimea and access to the Black Sea. Two problems here. One, according to Robert Person of West Point, the actual goal was to prevent the westernization of Kiev. The Crimea does not accomplish that. What they needed to do was topple Kiev, and they failed at that. Second, the fact that they expanded into Donbass and Luhansk indicates that all they wanted was not Crimea. The real facts on the ground contradict their analysis. Then the real place to affirm is going to be on decreasing aggression. They say that they're never going to cave because they need to appear infallible. Problem is, he already has caved. According to Naim, who's a cold drop, Russia already has pulled out many troops out of eastern Ukraine. He already, since the rebel leaders have said they've already lost. Then they say that military spending has increased 34%. 3 points of information here. First, this increase was budgeted in 2010. It was not from the sanctions. Second, according to Grove of the Wall Street Journal, the economic harms resulted in them being unable to sustain this increase. As a result, they decreased this expected increase to 0.8%. That's a net negative. But third, and this is really important, the depreciation of the ruble as a result of sanctions means even if the ruble amount of military spending increases, the purchasing power of that spending decreases. So on net, Brookings finds Russia can no longer afford to win in the Ukraine. Then they say the root cause is internal development. They're missing the duality between intent versus capacity. Then they say that the costs are, Mina proved from Morgan that the costs are high enough. The 9% decrease in the economy is huge. Cutting off 9% of your body is the equivalent of cutting off 9% of the economy. Then they say PAPE 95% failed. This is very outdated. It's looking at the Cold War. We outweigh on 3 levels. First is on probability. When they concede economic harms, when there are economic harms, see 94% success rate. We outweigh on probability. Second on magnitude, when Naim says they already are withdrawing, we get the best magnitude. Third, even if they prove that intent increases to invade, the capacity decreases. That is a prerequisite. On their case, remember the term from Dreyer. This is by harming the economy, you decrease the social contract, so the nationalism decreases in the long term. The oligarchs are infighting more in the long term. In the long term, the Ukraine is safer, the West is safer, sanctions are good.
We will start prep now.
Okay.
Okay.
These are our best.
Yeah. Is everybody ready? Okay. start off on the two worlds analysis. There are other options than just nothing or sanctions. He says that Russia can just pull out and then get the carrot, or Russia can just do what the West wants, get the carrots, and then violate the ceasefire or treaty again. But that really doesn't make sense, because the way diplomacy works, right, is those carrots are continuously supplied. If Russia violates that, if Russia violates the agreement, the West can just take it away. It's not as simple as they would like you to think it is. But now let's go to whether or not Russia wants more of Ukraine. Two key pieces of analysis. First of all, according to Henry Hale of The Guardian in 2015, Eastern Ukraine satisfied a sweet spot because it satisfied both the Russian expansionists and the Russian nationalists. Now, if expanding into Western Ukraine violates that. But more importantly, Harrison says, and this goes dropped, that Russia wants a buffer as well. It is not in their interest to have a war with the West. They want a buffer. Expanding further into Western Ukraine is certainly not in the interest of of Russia. So if we show you uniquely that after sanctions, that threat increased, that they tried to take more land, that's a reason that you vote for us. First of all, he collapses on military spending and capability. But I would argue that intent in the context of Russia is much more important. Russia is already the second most powerful military in the world, way more powerful than Eastern Ukraine, Moldova, or Georgia. That means that if we show you that sanctions uniquely make them invade into these places, we should win the round. They say that military spending has decreased, but on net, it's actually increased just a little bit less than the expected budget, and we show uniquely that because of the oligarchs warrant, which is really mishandled, that sanctions are going to increase aggression. Now let's go to that. He responds with infighting, and that Putin doesn't look at who's in his inner circle based off of the Forbes rankings. But he really does. When you look at power within America and within Russia, they look at who's in the inner circle based on who has money. Money is influence, and the issue is that the pro-Western elites are being sanctioned, and so the military hardliners are getting more support, and they are the ones that want to send 100,000 into Kiev. Ultimately, we show, and this also goes unresponded to, that violence in Ukraine is unchanged. Ceasefires are violated every single day.
Right?
Yeah.
What does the depreciation of the ruble do to Russia's budget?
Probably pretty high.
Right. Well, no. Describe its effects.
I would say it makes the Russian ruble less powerful. They don't have as much money to use for their military. I agree to all of this. Okay?
Right. So, like,
But
when you're spending, let's say, 100 billion rubles, what used to buy 100 tanks now buys like 70 tanks, right?
Yeah,
That's-
understood.
I don't know how much a ruble.
that's still 70 more tanks than Ukraine
Well,
has.
no.
Yes.
Well, Ukraine has 0 tanks.
I mean, look, if Russia is able to buy more tanks with the military spending, that's still more tanks that they're gaining between Ukraine and Russia.
No.
The gap is increasing.
No, that's actually like a really important point. This is actually the actual function of the framework, which has been like a little muddled. Your idea is that prior to sanctions, we are on this trajectory where they're originally planning on developing and spending, buying, and having a larger military budget. That means that even if in nominal amounts, you're increasing the amount of spending. If that spending is a lot less than what would have
Even if
happened
we grant
without
you-
sanctions, that's going to be a net positive
Sam,
for the world.
Even if we grant you that sanctions have decreased the amount of military spending, I say in summary that intent is much more important because Russia's military is still far more powerful than the satellite states that it borders.
Yeah, right. You say that, for instance, they're the second most powerful in the world, right?
Yes.
I'm presuming the United States is first. Right?
Yes.
How well did that do, say, and I'm assuming, for instance, Iraq is not above first. So, how well did the #1 military, the more powerful military, for instance, do in Iraq?
There are a lot of differences between the situation in Eastern
Or
Ukraine
any
and
other
Iraq,
war
specifically because of what I say in summary, which is that Eastern Ukrainians actually align much with Russia. Iraqis did not
Name
align
any
with
other
America.
conflict.
Also,
which
in
this is
Iraq,
worse.
we won the war, but then just failed to nation build afterwards.
Right, no,
Whoa,
here's the-
whoa. Like that.
I would dispute the narrative that we won the war, but
wait.
here's the point, though, right? Just because you're higher on a ranking of military power does not mean
But
that you have the
no,
capacity to
in
take the
this-
state.
okay.
Brookings says they
Do
should
not
no longer afford to do
conflate. Do
so.
not conflate the Iraqi conflict with the Eastern Ukrainian conflict. Iraqis did not align with the United
When was the
States.
last
They
time
did not ask
occupation
for the
worked?
United States military to come in.
When was the last time an occupation of foreign territory worked?
I would
Anywhere in
say
the world.
it's working right now for Russia and
Before
Crimea.
this, because we're disputing that, saying that's not true.
No,
Any time in
no,
history
you're not
after, say,
disputing.
post-World
You're
War
not
II,
disputing
when does
that
this
the
work?
occupation in Crimea isn't working. You're just disputing that Russia cannot now further go, cannot expand further.
No. What
Yeah.
we're saying is that they're also pulling out of troops. This is clean dropped.
No.
Naim, who says they're pulling out troops out of Eastern Ukraine.
It's not clean dropped. We respond to it by saying that Russia is replacing that with different types of political destabilization, and we said, according to the Guardian, daily fighting still occurs.
Yes, daily fighting still occurs. This is the whole point. Just because fighting occurs does not mean that the fighting, that's not because of sanctions. That would have occurred regardless of sanctions. We're seeing it, the only thing that's causal that's been reduced.
We're saying it wouldn't because
We have a minute.
interest from that.
We have a minute 37, right? We'll be taking that minute 37. Thank you. Starting now. Oh, even more second most powerful. Still in the military spending. Yes. You guys ready?
Yep.
We're ready? Yeah. You guys ready? Starting briefly on this idea of framework, where they say that other options exist, but we proved to you by looking at the historical record, those aren't the most likely options. To the point where the most recent time when Russia tried to invade a country, for instance in Moldova and Georgia, we did nothing. To the point where Fabriks tells you that encouraged the expansion because Russia think they can get away with expanding without any cost. That's going to be encouraging Russia's aggression. However, that should be enough for you to affirm. However, I want to make this very clear. I'm still going to prove to you why we win, even if you do not believe our framework. And under our framework and theirs, the primary issue in today's round is going to subsume all others, how sanctions stop Russia's advance in two ways. One, by sending the signal that they can no longer get away with just expanding to other countries. And second, and most importantly, by destroying their financial capacity. They respond to this by saying that, from Hale, that Russia didn't want to expand further into Ukraine because they just wanted a buffer state. This ignores what Will pointed out, which is that it isn't a buffer state as long as Ukraine is still westernized. That's why Person explains that their goal was to expand further into Ukraine, because having just an enclave in eastern Ukraine does not prevent Kiev from becoming a Western nation, which is what their main goal was here. They did want to expand. Then they said that, Russia's already the second most powerful military in the world, they'll win regardless of the economy. But as we point out, from instance Iraq, or any single other war you choose to look at, just being a stronger military in terms of firepower on the list does not guarantee success. Money still matters, to the point where Brookings Institute explains this is clean extended, that they can no longer afford to win in Ukraine. That's going to be really important destruction of Russia's expansionary capacity. Then they say military spending increases, but ignoring the fact that yes, maybe it's true in nominal amounts, but to the point where there's a reduction relative to now 0.8%, relative to the 25% earlier, relative to what they had absent sanctions. And second, the depreciation of the ruble means that even that value is being destroyed even more, means that overall military spending declines. Here's how this outweighs every single issue. One, on probability, to the point where Naim tells you that already we've seen them pull out of eastern Ukraine, and Morgan says because the economic effects that they concede, we're seeing a 94% success rate, that outweighs in probability. But second, on prerequisite, even if you believe that the elites are going to make them more want to expand, even if they have a greater intent to expand, to the point where Brookings says they can no longer afford to expand, even if their intent increases, their capacity goes down, the threat goes down, and that's why you should affirm.
Opponents, partner, all three of my judges. First,
first start off on Russian intent. Here's what they dropped. The other part of the Hale analysis, which essentially explains that the reason why Russia didn't want to invade past Crimea is because that's the only part of the region where the ethnic concentration appeased the ethnic nationalists. Beyond that, Hale tells you that violent protests would have erupted throughout the streets, and that would have been a serious detriment to the rule of Vladimir Putin. Insofar as that's true, that's a warrant for why Putin did not want to expand past Crimea. Moreover, we show you that essentially that's the strategic area of the region for him. What does this mean? This means that any violence that's currently happening in Ukraine isn't a result of Russia's original intent, but a result of their change in their decision-making calculus. If we show you that sanctions are in any way responsible for that change, that is the only net increase in aggression in this round, because Russia didn't even want most of the lands in Ukraine anyways, like Kiev, because they don't want to be edging up to the west. The first way we show you that this happens is through the military hardliners, which essentially goes conceded by Sam in Final Focus. He only tries to outweigh by saying that military capability solves back for that. But we tell you that essentially Russia wouldn't even be trying to get this land in the first place if it weren't for the decision-making change that sanctions caused. At the end of the day, that's why the oligarchs are pushing for a 100,000 troop change in this region. Moreover, they tell you on the 9 evidence, they tell you that Russia is pulling out, but we read you evidence literally from the end of December that tells you that violence is still occurring every single day. Realize that this violence wouldn't be occurring if there wasn't a change caused in Putin's strategic decision-making calculus. We tell you that this was specifically because of sanctions. The other reason why you can buy that is because of the economic analysis that we give you. We tell you that the only way that Putin knows how to power project is by increasing his military strength abroad when economic strength goes down. That's why the Wood analysis, which goes dropped, tells you that the root cause of Russia's challenge to the West is in failed development patterns by Russia. Insofar as they only perpetuate that cycle, they are literally linking into the root cause of Russian aggression. I can see no other ballot but for the negative.